Thank you all very much. Bill said we have docents and staff, etc. I'm here because I'm just handsome. So, just a little bit of my background. I was asked the question how I got interested in the piano and in music and things like that. So, I thought I would start off by just talking a little bit about that. Remembering what my 14 or 16-year-old granddaughter constantly tells me, Grandpa, it's not about you. So, we will move through this quickly. How I learned to love good music. I came from a musical family in some ways. My dad played the cornet. I had a great aunt who played the piano. I think it caused her to die early. She only lived to be 103. And when I was young, my parents bought a piano. Now, they bought it for my brother, I think, because I remember my dad telling my brother, David, if you learn how, this is my brother, by the way, David, if you learn how to play the piano and you go to a party, girls will hang all over you, okay? Being wise and skeptical, he took the guitar up instead. But I gravitated to the piano, and so I kind of learned to really appreciate that. Our family was oriented to country, western, and gospel music, quartet music, and things like that. We learned such wonderful songs from two of my uncles who liked to play in bars. Such songs as Cigarettes and Whiskey and Wild Wild Women. They'll drive you crazy, they'll drive you insane. And songs with my grandfather, my little girl, now she's a whopper, she weighs 400 pounds. But anyway, you learn those things. The first record I ever bought and drove my mother nuts playing, how many of you remember Ricky Nelson's Traveling Man? Okay, that's the first record I ever bought on a 45 LP, and I went nuts with that record. And I did eventually study voice and piano. But everything changed. This is really right here. Everything changed for me in the 7th grade thanks to an insane public school teacher. If I'd been in a Catholic school, she would have been Attila the Nun. This woman was about as scary as she could be. But for one semester, believe it or not, she had us listen. And I tried to remember, and I think to the best of my memory, Haydn's Surprise Symphony, Mozart's Ein Klein Nachtmusik, Beethoven's Fifth, Debussy's Afternoon of Faun, Dukas the Sorcerer's Apprentice, the New World Symphony, Grieg Peer Gynt Suite, Rimsky-Korsakov Scheherazade, Ferdi Gruffet Grand Canyon Suite, Sibelius Finlandia, Peter Tchaikovsky 1812 Overture, okay? We listened to those on old 33 records. In the final test that semester, she would drop the needle and we had to guess the name of the piece, we had to guess the composer, and if it had movements, we had to tell what movement it was. Okay? Can you imagine that? In 7th grade? In 7th grade. I was telling a lawyer friend of mine in town about that, and he said, I did the same thing as an undergraduate at Notre Dame. So I think it's important that we do instill within kids an early appreciation of that music, because otherwise they may never be able to develop it. I don't know why that music captivated me, but it did, and it has become such a blessing to me. By the way, our artist that won the piano competition, I noticed in the notes that he studied with a gentleman named James Tocco. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, is James Tocco still teaching? He said, no, he's retired. I heard James Tocco, the concert pianist, play Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto at a small suburb of Detroit, Allen Park, Michigan, over 50 years ago. He was a tall, handsome, good-looking guy. But the other thing I really remember, he had a drop-dead gorgeous niece who I sat next to in 8th grade music. And she totally blew it, so you know. Anyway, that's enough about that. So what we're here today to talk about is Steinway, Rubinstein, and Ruthmere's chance to shine. And what I want to focus on as we go through this stuff is the whole subject of excellence. Because that's one of the things that is so important here at Ruthmere. Whatever we try to do, Bill, the staff, they try to make it excellent. Why are we talking about these things together? Well, Robert Beardsley purchased this piano, a 9-foot Model D, in 1972. This was purchased from Stennart and Sons in Boston. And it was noted that when Arthur Rubinstein was in Boston, this piano was reserved exclusively for his use by Stennart and Sons. Stennart and Sons was founded in 1860, and believe it or not, they're still in business today. Arthur Rubinstein, whenever he would go to a city, usually had a selection. In Europe, he used Busendorfers and some of those kinds of pianos. But here, he used pretty much Steinways. It's interesting how you can tell the difference between a Steinway and a Baldwin. Other artists have used Baldwin. There's a difference in the tone quality of those things. So that's why we're doing this. So we're going to start with a brief review of the history of keyboards, an overview of the Steinway family, and then we're going to talk about Arthur Rubinstein. And then I'm going to give you a bonus segment on our friend here, Sergei Rachmaninoff. The parents of the piano really come down to two things. Everything evolves in process. There's no really original product. It's usually a combination. It's either an enhancement or a substitute of something else. The clavichord is really early, you notice it's stringed and it has a keyboard, and it was used in the late Middle Ages, but it did not have much volume. It was primarily a practice or a composition piece. The harpsichord, with its development, was a stringed instrument like the piano, but it was plucked, and as you can see here, this is what would actually pluck the string, okay, and that's how you made the sound. So you were limited in terms of the volume and all that. It did not have the kind of volume that we're used to in hearing a modern piano. And there was a continued development. Now, the gentleman, by the way, we're no relation even though we have a similarity. The gentleman here who did the best, who really put the whole thing together, the desire to combine the wonderful tone-sustaining capacity of the clavichord with the power of the harpsichord, limited though it was, is what drove to the creation of the pianoforte. The first one was made by Bartolomeo Cristofori in Padua, Italy, and he did it in 1707. A final version came in 1720. He was also in the employ of the Medici family, so he had plenty of money and plenty of time to develop the piano. His piano used a much stronger case than the current harpsichord. That would withstand the increased strength of the strings and give more volume. And an individual damper for each note, so that, you know, if you hit a note and you don't want it to keep sounding, you got to dampen it somehow. And he created a very usable action. Action was very important in the creation of the piano. This is his 1720 piano, and this is fascinating. It boasted all the features of the modern instrument. So if you hear an old, a 18th century piano, this part will sound very similar to what it does today. Where you really notice the difference is when you get down with the harp and the longer strings and the crossing over, which we'll get into in a little bit. This development continued through the 18th century, but you'll notice a lot of similarity. That then brings us to this family of the Steinways. Very prominent family. This is the founder, Heinrich, and the name was actually Steinway originally. Theodore, Charles, Henry, William, and Albert became very prominent in the creation of the Steinway product. And we will take a look. Henry Steinway, 1797-1871. He's a 12th child of respectable parents, which is a good way to start. If you start with disreputable parents, it really makes it bad in the village. You could have a hard time making any progress. Napoleon's army burned the family home and killed several of his brothers. Perhaps he did not have a great love of the French. He was orphaned at 15, and 18 he saw action at the Battle of Waterloo, which I'm sure he was happy about the way that it ended. But here's what's fascinating. During this time, he learned to handle tools and played the zither. He never had formal training with either tools or music, if you can believe that. And I know it says tolls, ignore the fact. Spell check doesn't always do everything I want it to do. But, you know, if you buy a Steinway, you're going to pay a toll. At 21, he was employed as a cabinet maker, but he wanted to learn to make musical instrument, and so he got a job basically working in Sachsen, Germany with it, and then he played organ at the local church, taught himself how to play the organ at the local church. He married in 1825, and his wedding present to his new bride was the first piano built by Steinway's own hands. Can you imagine that? He gave her a piano. She probably wanted a diamond, but she couldn't wear this on her finger, but maybe she learned to play. Making pianos, repairing organs, and making all kinds of musical instruments soon became his life's work. It became his passion. And there is something so remarkable to me about a man with no formal education who learns how to play these things. Do all of you know what a zither is, by the way? It's like a lap thing. You remember the Beverly Hillbillies? Grandma played a zither, okay? There was a salesman that sold those things in northern Minnesota at one time, and he said what people didn't know. They'd give him music when they'd tell him that they didn't know when they played the key of C. If they tried to do anything else, then they were screwed up because they were only playing the key of C, the ones he was selling. But anyway, these are the sons, all handsome individuals. And of course, the length of your beard had something to do with your prosperity to a certain establishment. He established himself as a piano manufacturer and business, and he grew. His son Theodore, Charles, and Henry joined him in the business. Now, each of them brought unique gifts to the process. Charles was active in the Revolution of 1848 and found himself fleeing to Switzerland, eventually to New York by way of Paris and London. He sent home reports glowing in the New World. Now remember, the 1848 was a time started in Sicily and then spread through Europe. It was a revolt against monarchies and all that kind of stuff. And part of the issue was starvation, economic structures, and all that kind of stuff. It also gave an impetus to Karl Marx with the Communist Manifesto during that period of time as well. So we don't really know totally what Charles' perspectives were. Obviously, he was outside of the reservation, and so he ended up in the New World. And he comes over here and he starts writing these glowing letters back home. Things are great, we can really prosper, etc., etc. So the entire family, except for Theodore, moved to New York in 1851. Now, here's to me something that's absolutely fascinating and brilliant. So they come over here, they already have some ability and knowledge of how to make pianos, right? They each take a job in a different piano manufacturers. Okay, because there were a lot of manufacturers of pianos back then. So they each take a job at the different manufacturers, and then they would learn what was going on. They wanted to learn the language, for one thing. They wanted to learn business practice in the New World, and they wanted to learn basically how they could take what was being done and then make improvements on it. So, I mean, you got to give people credit. So it took them, and they spent 2 years doing that, learning everything they could about how this stuff was being made. The experience of working for others for a couple of years was invaluable in knowing how to create pianos and you take what somebody's doing well and you enhance it. You put a little bit more excellence into the product, and that's how you make something different. I worked for a man for several years named Clarence Yoder, and one of the finest men I ever worked for. He'd been raised Amish, and then he got in the RV business, he worked at Skyline. And Skyline made a good but basic product. And Clarence had this vision, how can I make something better? How can I make something better? And eventually that became Carriage Industries and built some of the finest recreational vehicles, fifth wheels mostly when I was there. But anyway, same kind of thing. Learn, and if somebody's doing it better, don't mess with it. But if you can do it better, go ahead. They officially opened in 1853. I was not at the opening, but I heard it went really well. The first manufacturer in America was number 483. It was number 483 because they had built 482 pianos. This piano, by the way, is modeled, I think it's 365,000 or something like that. So that tells you it's the 365th thousandth piano that Steinway made. They manufactured 2 pianos a week, and they, again, capitalized on each person's gift. Henry was experienced, and he was the careful businessman. Charles had the ability and did his task admirably. He managed the factory. Managing a factory is not an easy job, as you know. He was a good organizer. Unfortunately, he died in 1865 at the age of 36. Henry had a wonderful inventive imagination. In addition, he was a good amateur musician, mixed with all kinds of people, so he would get along with a lot of people. He could schmooze people, but he loved the nightlife. He loved the nightlife, and eventually it caught up with him. He was like the salesman that got called into the office one day, and the boss says, "Bill, have you been drinking to excess?" He says, "No, sir, just to capacity." So I think that was maybe a little bit of what happened here with Charles. With the passing of Charles and Henry Jr., this left the younger brother, William, to run things for his father. Now, William had the opportunity of going into music, but he decided not to. So, Theodore eventually comes over. He worked at about every aspect of the piano. And here again, proper alloys for casting the iron plates. What's the best material used to make felts? What's the best glue? What's the best varnish? Constantly experimenting and using a scientific method to try to figure out the best possible way to create a piano. He did not create anything unique. What he did was revolutionize piano manufacturing by adding significant research and development to the process. 2 women, Catholic and Methodist lady, decided to go to each other's church one time, and they were going to explain to each other what happened in church. So they first go to the Catholic church, and the guy was saying, okay, this is the Kyrie, this is the Agnus Dei, this is the Sanctus, etc. Well, then he gets to the Methodist church, and he goes, well, this is our introduction, and this is and the pastor got up preaching, he took his watch off, and said, here, the Catholic lady turned for him, What's that mean? Why did he do that? Shit doesn't mean a darn thing. But anyway, I'm going to try to pay attention to the time. Okay, the youngest son, Albert, chose to make piano his career. And after Charles' death, he became the manager of the factory. He was key. This is amazing. He was key in developing Steinway Village. Probably never heard of Steinway Village. Now, let me go back to that illustration I told you about the manufacturer that I worked for. Carriage Incorporated tried as much as possible to make everything that went in their unit. We made our own fiberglass, we made our own holding tanks, we made our own furniture, everything that we could possibly make on site, Claire and children wanted. The goal was, I want to control every part of the process because my quality of my product is only as good as my weakest component part. Well, that's exactly the idea here. He constructed sawmills, iron factory, anything that was going into the product they wanted to have control over. Unfortunately, while accomplishing a great deal, Albert was none too strong. Constitution gave way. You notice these guys were all dying in their mid-30s, okay? Like a lot of composers. I mean, Chopin was in his 30s, Mozart was in his 30s. You know, a lot of great people die young. I'm not feeling that well myself today, but anyway. Okay, why is technology important? Well, there are 12,116 individual parts that make up a Steinway grand piano. Can you believe that? If anybody wants to count them, you're welcome to. This is amazing. The action for just one key is made up of over 57 individual parts. That's 4,500 parts. So every time you strike a key, you've got that much going on in the piano, which is incredible to me. You don't think about it. You sit there, and even if you play wrong notes, you've still done something wonderful, you know, which is very helpful to me. We're going to go through some accomplishments real quick. By 54, they were building these. This piano right here was given to Theodore Roosevelt to put in the White House. This is the Steinway that is currently in the White House. Now, the World's Fair was a big thing for them in 1855 because they used what became the overstrung plate, where the long bass strings were drawn over sections. If you have an opportunity to come up here and look at this piano, you'll notice that the bass strings actually go this way across. That allows the strings to be longer, the tension to be heavier, and the sound to be louder, okay? That was really, really innovative, and he got a patent for that. You can see it all right here. In a straight strung frame, that doesn't happen. Okay, let me get through this quickly. The Juilliard School became an all Steinway school. I did this just because it amazed me. Vladimir Horowitz and Sergei Rachmaninoff went in the basement of Steinway Hall one day, and they played Rachmaninoff's third piano concerto. Can you imagine that? These two legends in the basement playing away at this music. The diaphragmatic soundboard was very important. Because we are getting a little short on time, if any of you want all this information, I'll be happy to send it to you. And the accelerated action. This is interesting. The touch of a Steinway is the most responsive of any piano made. In fact, laboratory tests have proven that the keys of the Steinway piano can repeat 14% more quickly than the keys of any other piano. 14% more. So you get somebody who's doing one of these bits, which would do a good artist would do a lot faster than that, but it's all going to be there. Nothing is more discouraging for a pianist than when you play a note and it doesn't respond, or if you have one go dead when you're playing too. That's very discouraging too. Okay, let's just go through here. Until his death in 2007, Henry Steinway, the great-grandson of the founder, was still signing every art piano that was done. Steinway today is currently owned by Paulson and Company, and it sold for $512 million in 2013. Any of you invested? Okay. All right. Now, this just is the various Steinways that you can buy. Ours is the largest, the Model D, and that's the way the sizes are. Arthur Rubinstein. This brings us to Arthur Rubinstein. Arthur Rubinstein was born in Lodz, Poland on January 28, 1886 to a Jewish family. He's the youngest of 7 children. And as you know, Poland has had ups and downs. Hard times have been Russia, which goes back to the old story of the farmer that lived on the border. And after one of the wars, they came to him and said, all right, Stash, here's the deal. From now on, your farm is going to be in Poland. He says, thank God I can't take another Russian winter. So anyway, by the age of 3, he's playing the piano. Can you imagine that? 3 years old, he's playing the piano. He developed a close relationship to his cousin Noemi. and they developed a certain attitude towards life. I just finished reading a book by Friedrich Nietzsche, which I don't recommend, called Human All Too Human. He makes a point there that every life comes down to some significant moments. And that's the thing, when we go through and we look at the excellence in the way Arthur Rubinstein lived his life, it really comes down to some defining moments. Well, here's one right here. When they would play, they would listen to fairy tales, but soon they began to invent their own stories. And this passion grew. Life appeared more continuous, a continuous fairy tale. I'm happy to say I have never changed that feeling towards life. Okay? A beautiful approach to life that Arthur Rubinstein had. And then in 1894, his cousin died. And he said, my childhood was over. If you can think back to the first significant person you ever lost, that is a defining moment in your life. That will change the way you think about things. By the time he was 10 years old, his father's business had collapsed and the family went bankrupt. So money became a big issue. And he made his debut at 13 years old, playing the A minor concerto of Mozart. And then he decided to play a duet by Mendelssohn, and suddenly my mind became blank and I couldn't remember a single note. Thing we were talking about earlier. Ignacy Paderewski, who we'll get to in a minute, had a very fabulous and well-received initial recital in Paris. So much so that they asked him to do another recital. So he crams for several weeks and learns this music, and he gets out and he plays a second recital, and it's very well received by the critics. He woke up the next morning and he couldn't remember one piece he played. It's gone, totally. And he realized, I've got to learn it slow, and I've got to learn it over time, or I will lose it. By the time he's 10 years old, oh, I'm sorry, he made it, yeah, I said that. Shelley, correct me if I screw up. Joseph Joachim, a famous violinist, recommended that Heinrich Barth become the boy's piano teacher. And look at this. This gave Rubinstein a place in the renowned pedagogical lineage. Barth was a pupil of Liszt, who had been taught by Czerny, who at one time had been taught by Beethoven. It's amazing how these things overlap and how these people come together. Every pianist can thank Franz Liszt for screwing us up. He's the first clown who ever decided he would play from memory in public. And everybody had to do it after that. Up till then, everybody used their music. And so anybody who has memory lapses can curse him to the day they die. But he developed a rather torturous relationship with his professor because he kept limiting him. He kept not letting him do the things he wanted to do. For example, he wanted to learn the D minor concerto of Brahms. He loved Brahms. And Barth said, no, it's too much for you, much for you. This is formative work, too difficult. Rubinstein says, real love knows no obstacles. A week later, I played the concerto to Barth's amazement. But still, Barth would not be flexible, and soon ran into a disagreement with his father over money, and he felt his father let him down. Here's another defining moment. I loved my parents, but a moral and a physical chain linked to me had been broken forever. He developed a motto that says, I shall never submit. And I've stuck to that motto all my life. So those relationships can sometimes mess you up. This is hilarious. This is his practice method as a young man, okay? I'd lock my door, put my Anna Karenina or Russian or Polish on the music stand, place some chocolates on my right, cherries on my left, and start playing a few mechanical exercises with my left hand alone while I reach for chocolates with my free hand and turn the pages of my novel. The household thought I'd never worked better, but the result was disastrous, always having to make feverish last-minute preparations for my lessons. He was one of those people who was so gifted he didn't have to work hard in some ways. And he got by for quite a while being that way. Then he meets Paderewski. Paderewski was a rock star. Do you realize Ignacy Paderewski was the third prime minister of Poland? He was so well known at the end of World War II, he was made prime minister for a period of time. He also, the only guy I ever knew who had a piano built into his car. Can you imagine that? He had a car with a piano. It says going down the road, he could play music. That was before the days of the boom boxes. And people in carriages would tell him, please turn it down. Anyway. So when Paderewski asked him to play something, he decided to play the second volume of Brahms' Paganini Variations. A big mistake because he hadn't mastered it. And he made mistakes. Paderewski very graciously says, my dear young man, don't be disheartened by a few wrong notes. I know you were not at your best, but I can see you have talent. Later in conversation, Paderewski, when he was a young man, was passionately in love with his wife. They had a child, and the child and the wife both died. Later in conversation that summer with Paderewski, he shared the loss. So this famous, happy, rich Paderewski, I thought with amazement, realizing that I had been in the presence of one of the most unhappy human beings I had ever met. Isn't that amazing? The guy had everything. He had wealth, he had power, and all, but it wasn't necessarily enough. But he began to work hard, and he started to really build a solid repertoire of music. And this was possible for my special gift of grasping the meaning and the structure of a piece of music and my remarkable memory. I could play anything after a few readings. Now get this. Though of course neglecting many details, especially when they were due to technical problems. But I was too eager to accumulate as much repertoire to worry about flaws. And he'll talk a little bit more about that later. He made his debut in America at 19, and it was mediocre. Because he says, when I was young, I was lazy. He hadn't worked enough. He didn't have a solid enough repertoire. And when I played in Russia, because of my namesake, Anton Rubinstein, who was no relation, had conditioned audience to hear wrong notes. Okay? But when I played in England or America, they felt that they paid their money and they were entitled to hear all the notes. So, it became a struggle with recordings, because you go to hear a concert pianist today, and very likely you've got a recording. And that recording may have been touched up and changed so that you don't get the wrong notes. When Horowitz did his return concert at Carnegie Hall, he started off playing, it was a Bach toccata, I think a Bach Busoni toccata, dun, 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 and he made a wrong note. And afterwards he wanted them to correct it. And they said, no, we're not going to correct it. This is what happened. But a lot of times that stuff does get corrected. So he lacked his technique, but here was his attitude. To H with the German pianists and their exact fingering. Temperament. I was spoiled, I admit it. But I have never played in Germany since 1914. I don't care. I've escaped their criticism. Now that's a good attitude. I thought this was funny. He was in San Francisco when the great earthquake came, and he saw Enrique Caruso running like a rabbit in his nightshirt. So Gabriel Ostruck becomes his manager, but he got discouraged with it because Arthur wasn't working hard enough. So here's another really defining moment. He becomes really low on funds. Now, nobody in this room has ever been short of money. I know that. So you guys can't relate to this. So I went 2 weeks without news of getting this money. The idea of suicide was not novel to me. It had been on my mind before, and I couldn't think of anything else. Lacking firearms and poison, he decided to hang himself. As a result, I pushed the chair away with my foot, the belt tore apart and fell on the floor with a crash. He cried bitterly, lying where I had fallen with no strength left. End of the rope, another incredible defining moment. But look at what happens. Out of the despair, something wonderful happens. Once he stopped crying, nature took over. He was hungry and decided to have 2 sausages. What did he care about cholesterol if he was going to die, right? He goes out in the street and stops. Something very strange came over him. I looked at everything around me with new eyes, as if I had never seen any of it before. The street, the trees, the houses, dogs chasing each other, men and women, the noise of the city. I was fascinated by all of life. Life, it seems beautiful and worth living, even in prison or a hospital, if you look at it that way. Well, on that night, a new conception of life and a new creation of values for all my private use left me only this chaos of thoughts. I discovered the secret of happiness, and I will cherish it. Love life for better or worse, without conditions. Another incredible defining moment. The character of this man is to me as impressive as anything he did musically. Oh, I gotta go. Anyway, let's go to this. This is the guy that really made Arthur Rubinstein popular in America, Saul Hirok. I don't know if any of you remember Saul Hirok. He was a very famous impresario. He had Fyodor Shaliapin, Isadora Duncan, Marian Anderson were clients of his. And he pursued Rubinstein for several years before he finally convinced him to come back to America, because Rubinstein didn't really care all that much for America. He wrote Shaliapin 3 years in a row. If any of you are familiar with Fyodor Shaliapin, he was the standard. If you ever hear Boris Godunov, he was a standard by which all bassos have to compare themselves. Well, he pursued, and finally he gets a letter from Shaliapin and says, come to Paris, they'll meet me in my hotel room. 3 years in a row. So he gets there, he walks in the room, Shaliapin says, I'll never go to America. Why did you call? Because he didn't have a lot of money. He said, why did you call me here? He said, I just wanted to see who would have the nerve to write me 3 years in a row. But he did eventually get him to come to America, and they made some good money together. He first heard Rubinstein at Carnegie Hall in 22 and 23. He did return to the United States in 27, but was not that impressed. So he pursued him. Finally, in 1937, he and his wife arrived back in America. He played 17 concerts in 9 weeks. If you could imagine that, that's a horrific schedule for any pianist. Having got all the accolades and everything, but they didn't make a lot of money. One of the most electric things Rubinstein brought to the concerts wasn't just great pianistic technique. He brought his own personal dynamism to everything he did. Here is how Saul Herock describes it. The door opens to a room after a concert. The door opens to the room and suddenly it shrinks in size as people pour in. He greets them, remembering the name, the face, even the language of each, during one among his 7 tongues and frequently at home in each. Kissing the ladies' hands, reminiscing, dropping an encouraging word to a young pianist just beginning, and all at lightning speed, so graciously that no one in the room feels he has been hurried through his greeting, nor given anything less than proper moment with his idol. That's an amazing gift to be able to put people at ease like that. Bill's good at that kind of thing. Part of the success of Rubinstein is his ability to gauge an audience. We talked about that. This is a young lady, Janina Falkowska, I think it is, decided to pursue a career as a concert pianist after she heard Rubinstein. 12 years old, she heard Rubinstein with the Montreal Symphony play the Schumann Concerto and the Chopin Concerto back to back. Can you imagine that? 2 concertos in one evening, back to back. Chopin wrote both of his concertos before he was 25 years old. Some of these guys, and I don't think he ever wrote anything for an orchestra after that, but it's not an easy piece. I had never heard music bring it to my eyes. Then she gets involved in the Rubinstein piano competition. She comes in 3rd place. And while she was going to the competition, she had a relative of hers go sign her up for law school. She was going to be a lawyer. She came in 3rd and said to her relative, I'm not going to law school. And Rubinstein, for some reason, liked her, took her under his wing. And this is how she describes it. From the moment he woke up in the morning, when he came down to breakfast, he was like a child who was experiencing something fabulously new. This childlike quality, even at the age of 96, was amazing to me, in spite of wonderment and constant discovery that's over. That's what made him such a marvelous man. And I'm just going to briefly tell you this. They were with him one day and he had to go to the eye doctor. He was in his 90s, he was losing his eyesight. I think he had macular degeneration because he could only see partially. And the doctor told him, there's nothing I can do for you. You are going to not be able to see any better than this as long as you live. So they leave. Mrs. Rubinstein is driving. Arthur's sitting in the back humming tunes. And she's thinking, oh my gosh, the world's greatest pianist can't see. How tragic is this? And all of a sudden he blurts out, hey, let's go to a movie. Go to a movie? The man can hardly see. So they go to a movie. He loves it. Accepted life unconditionally. Had a good time. They got home late at night. That was Arthur Rubinstein. I won't go into his approach to money during the American tour. He found himself short of cash. It was the first time in my life that I had had a rather large sum in my possession. I learned to use money. Money as such had no other meaning for me than to be spent. In short, I was totally devoid of a sense of money, a failure that has proved fatal most of my life. I think he married a woman who helped him with that. Elsa Maxwell tells us regarding Rubinstein's prowess at the piano. He smashed the Prince of Wales piano, which had belonged to Queen Victoria, and with one chord of the powerful hands, it collapsed to the floor. I don't know if he was ever invited back. Rubinstein admitted that Horowitz was a better pianist, but he consoled himself by saying he was a better musician. At one point he says, there are young concert pianists who play better than I do, but when they come out on stage with their personality, they might as well be soda jerks. You had to sell it. I thought this was interesting. When Mussolini started his attacks against the Jews, Rubinstein had received the Commander of the Order of Italian Guards, a very distinguished honor. However, he returned it and he signed the telegram, Arthur Rubinstein, Jewish pianist. Good for him, good for him. Okay, real fast, Sergei Rachmaninoff. We have the hands of Sergei Rachmaninoff here. Let me just say, Sergei Rachmaninoff really got turned on to music through Tchaikovsky, okay? And after the performance of his first symphony, it was horribly received and he was incredibly depressed. And so he goes into therapy with this guy named Nikolai Dahl, who used what was called positive suggestion therapy, which sounded to me like what we would now call rational emotive therapy. But it did help. Now, there's a story that his grandson tells that the only reason he kept going to this doctor was he was in love with his daughter. But we'll stick with this story. But out of that came the second piano concerto. How many of you ever seen The 7-Year Itch with Marilyn Monroe? Okay, Tom Hoole, okay? That's the piece, whenever he's feeling romantic, that's the piece he imagines himself playing for Marilyn Monroe. Da, 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 da. So anyway, if you have one of those evenings, you want to listen to it, go ahead. He was conducted the Bolshoi. He arrived in America in 17, and here was the problem. He came to America as a composer. He had very little piano repertoire. Well, you can't really say to somebody, hey, let's do a concert of my music. So he had to learn a repertoire. He spent a long time just learning enough repertoire so he could go out in public. But eventually success. The thing of it was, Rachmaninoff, we are told, a composer almost completely tied to the old tradition, who attempted to expend romanticism of his successor Tchaikovsky. He never, you had Schoenberg and Shostakovich and all these guys writing experimental 12-tone music, etc., etc. Rachmaninoff kept writing like he lived only the 19th century. And guess whose music still gets played today? Rachmaninoff. Music is enough for a lifetime, but a lifetime is not enough for music. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Okay, so let me wrap this up. Steinway, Rubinstein, and Ruthmere's chant to sign all boils down to excellence. Excellence in the work of Bartolomeo Cristofori, the search for excellence in sound. The Steinways, the pursuit of excellence in your vocation. Rubinstein, the pursuit of excellence in living well, accepting life unconditionally. Rachmaninoff, the pursuit of excellence in the legacy you leave, a refusal to accept defeat. Excellent. The pursuit of excellence continues at Ruthmere, and if you don't have your fall concert tickets, today is not too early for you to buy them. Okay? You're going to hear 4 great artists this afternoon. I'm over time. Bill, sorry. Thank you all.